I'm going to speak about alternatives, and then we'll move on to a question and answer period. In its public relations material, Hudson River Valley Resorts has stated, quote, "Other alternatives to the property are simply not viable," unquote. Three such alternatives were discussed in the flyer that many of you got in the fall, and with a few sentences saying, dismissing each of them. But we believe that this is hype, and we believe that there are other alternatives that are viable. First of all, the seeker process requires that particular types of alternatives to the current project be examined with full documentation. From the perspective of the community and of seeker, there needs to be a separate vantage point from that of the developers from which the community can make a judgment about the relative merits of the various alternative options for the Williams Lake property. These need to be separate from the prime criteria for the developer, which is making a profit. What the developers propose is geared toward investors, not the community. So let's examine what are those alternatives. The official scope of the EIS required that there be a, quote, evaluation of the potential designation and use of the site as a publicly accessible open space or parkland, unquote, but this was not done by HRVR. This alternative and others I will describe would substantially fulfill the goals of the Rosendale Comprehensive Plan, as Morka said, and also the county and state open space and recreational plans. By providing resources and expanding recreational opportunities for the general public. In its PR brochure, HRVR wrote that a public park was not viable because it had been explored and was considered impossible given the fiscal situation of the state of New York. But in fact now, New York State is spending money on parks and parklands, and we don't know if this is still impossible. And we look forward to more data in the FEIS. Number two, the second alternative, a resort rehabilitation alternative, would restore the existing facilities, amenities, and trails under the current development footprint. And in its public relations brochure, HRVR wrote that this standalone resorts in our region has failed, and this alternative is not financially viable. But in fact, there are resorts that are doing quite well in our area. The third alternative was required. The conservation resort alternative would keep would avoid direct or indirect impacts on natural resources of the site. And in the DEIS, it was presented as having a smaller hotel and no detached housing. In Hudson River Valley Resorts PR flyer, this was described as a scaled-back resort with limited housing. It was argued that it was not viable because a modern resort requires revenues from both a hotel and from housing in order to get built. The figures in the DEIS for this and the former alternative were not broken down to justify their assertion that these were not financially viable. What was absent in HRVR's discussion of alternatives was the possibility of a private-public partnership or involvement of a land trust. This would generate a broader use for the property, which could still include a small hotel and provide more public access and enhance ecotourism. Such an alternative, rather than being planned for residents of a gated community, could bring more people to the Williams Lake property to enjoy its beauty and generate significantly more business for the local community. So in sum, we ask you to consider how high a profit for investors is necessary to make an alternative economically feasible. Does the community want profitability for the investors as a primary criterion for how the land should be used? Clearly, the project is geared toward the 1% of very wealthy people who could afford the homes. Other alternatives could better serve the 99% and allow greater access to the recreational resources of the site. Parasites. Which alternatives contribute to corporate profit and which to the public good? What the seeker process encourages us to do is to make our voices heard as to what alternatives we would like to see actualized, because there are other possibilities beyond the hype we've heard so far. So with that, what we're going to do is open up the session for questions and answers. I will say two things before we do that. One, we know an FEIS is forthcoming, and we certainly expect that there will be improvements, and it will be, some of these issues will be addressed, but the importance of listening to these issues and thinking about the issues that have been raised based upon what's been presented to date is that it can give us a critical lens. It can give us the eyes to look at the FEIS and say, have these problems been mitigated? Have these issues been addressed? And that's what the seeker process encourages everyone in the community to do and be involved in. And then secondly, we have many more people here tonight than we expected, so what we want to do is have as many voices heard as possible. So I'm going to ask that you make your question short and to the point. If you want to address it to a particular speaker, feel free to do so. And we're going to ask the respondents to keep their responses short and to the point so we can hear from as many different people as possible. So with that in mind, anyone who has a question, feel free to ask it, and we'll pass the mic as you.
Yep.